extremely pleased to welcome all of you. My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And I'm extremely delighted that today we're able to assemble a stellar team, two experts who will provide us with their insights and their knowledge about all things related to nuclear submarines and safeguards. As all of you know, on September 15th this year, the governments of Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States announced the creation of an enhanced trilateral security partnership between the three countries, or it's now known for its acronym AUKUS. The partnership, inter alia, entails the provision of a conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine fleet to Australia. Obviously, the announcement spurred multiple heated discussions, including about strategic and geopolitical impact of the deal, its potential implications for an arms race in Asia-Pacific on the relationship with France, potential impact on nuclear proliferation. But the majority of international experts also have raised questions about nuclear naval propulsion in the context of the global non-proliferation regime, and in particular in the application of the IAEA safeguards. This issue obviously is very relevant and of high interest here in Vienna, the home of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And we brought today two renowned experts on safeguards to discuss legal and practical mechanisms and past efforts in handling safeguards for nuclear naval propulsion, as well as the precedent this deal could set. I'm so pleased to welcome back Laura Rockwood, who is Director of Open Nuclear Network. And Laura probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but she spent 28 years at the IAEA working on legal aspects of safeguards issues. And before leaving the IAEA, she was the head section for non-proliferation policy in the Office of Legal Affairs. During her employment at the IAEA, she was the senior legal advisor on all aspects on the negotiation, interpretation, and implementation of IAEA safeguards, and was the principal author of the document that became the model additional protocol. Our other speaker is our own VCDNP, non-resident Celia Fellow, but of course he is more known for his former position as the Director General of the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office from 1989 to 2010. And at that time, he also chaired the IAEA Standing Advisory Group on Safeguards Implementation. SACSI was the alternative governor for Australia to the IAEA Board of Governors. He was also Australian Sherpa to Nuclear Security Summit in 2010, and continues to be active in many other fora, including in the Asia Pacific network. So with that, I am extremely delighted, and I am sure you're all looking forward to their remarks, and we will have a Q&A afterwards. But in the meantime, I would like to remind our audience that in order to submit your questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. For those of you who have joined us on YouTube, please feel free to send your question to events@vcdnp.org. With that, Laura, I'm looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you for having us. And thanks for setting the stage for this discussion of the intersection between submarines and safeguards. So let's just start with the basics. As required by the NPT, Australia concluded in 1974 a Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, or CSA, which is, as are all other CSAs, based on IMCIRC 153, a document that was negotiated by an open-ended working group of the Board of Governors in the early 1970s. Just to avoid confusion, the paragraph numbers in IMCIRC 153 correspond by and large to article numbers in the actual CSCs. But for this purpose, we'll focus on paragraph 14. Paragraph 14 is entitled "The Non-Application of Safeguards to Nuclear Material to be Used in Non-Peaceful Activities." It contains the procedures to be followed in the event that a state wishes to exercise its discretion to use nuclear material required to be safeguarded under the agreement in a nuclear activity which does not require the application of safeguards. This is often referred to as withdrawal of nuclear material from safeguards to distinguish it from provisions related to the termination of safeguards on nuclear material or the exemption of nuclear material from safeguards. Operation of this provision is not automatic, and it is not intended as a blanket exemption for nuclear material, facilities, or activities due to their military nature. A state may not withdraw nuclear material from safeguards without invoking paragraph 14 and concluding an arrangement with the IAEA. I thought I'd highlight some of the relevant historical events and then address several issues that have either arisen in the past or currently on the minds of those having to consider the implications of these issues. Only one state has ever invoked this provision, Canada, in the late 1980s. While we did initiate discussions on a possible arrangement within the IAEA, Canada decided not to pursue the project and no arrangement was ever concluded. Brazil is the only non-nuclear weapon state with an active nuclear naval propulsion program. It's already built a land-based prototype. Unlike the AUKUS project, the Brazilian project is based on a domestic fuel cycle, including conversion, enrichment of nuclear material using low enriched uranium, fabrication of the fuel and its assembly into the reactor core, all in Brazil. The agency has not yet, as far as I'm aware, received a request from Brazil to conclude a relevant arrangement. In 2012, Iran also announced its intention to produce nuclear-powered submarines and recently started producing uranium enriched to 60%, while Iran also recently alluded to the possible use of the 60% HEU for a submarine program. No formal announcements have been made in that regard. In addition, the ROK, the Republic of Korea, has also expressed interest in pursuing the acquisition of a nuclear-powered submarine, and in 2017, commissioned a feasibility study in that regard. However, neither Iran nor South Korea have raised with the agency the prospect of concluding a paragraph 14 arrangement. Just as an aside, in the 1960s and 70s, both Japan and Germany developed nuclear naval propulsion, but for surface ships and civilian applications. No special arrangements were concluded with those two countries. In terms of process, one of the key questions I've been asked is whether board approval of a paragraph 14 arrangement would be required. Paragraph 14 itself speaks only of the agency agreeing on the arrangement, not whether such an arrangement would be subject to board approval. The 1978 exchange of letters between the IAEA and Australia concerning the Secretariat's handling of paragraph 14 requests, which is referred to in my 2017 article, which I think VCDNP will post in the chat, is likewise ambiguous, suggesting that it would be for the board itself to determine what action would be appropriate. Should the matter be presented to the board by the DG, the board itself could decide that approval is necessary. There are agreements pro and con. On the one hand, the arrangement could be seen as similar to subsidiary arrangements, which are not approved by the board. Alternatively, it could be argued that such an arrangement is distinguishable from subsidiary arrangements, since the subsidiary arrangements relate to the implementation of safeguards agreements within parameters specifically laid down in agreements that had already been approved by the board. So focusing on a few substantive issues, what must the arrangement include? Well, a paragraph 14 arrangement must limit the non-application of safeguards only while the nuclear material in question is in such an activity, and it must require that safeguards are reapplied again as soon as the nuclear material is reintroduced into a peaceful nuclear activity. As to when exactly that might be, I'll touch on that in a moment. The arrangement must also identify, to the extent possible, the period or circumstances during which safeguards will not be applied. It must provide for the agency to be kept informed of the total quantity and composition of the material withdrawn from safeguards, whether that material is in the country or exported. However, the arrangement may only relate to such matters as temporal and procedural requirements and reporting arrangements. It is worth noting, however, that the list in 153 of what the arrangement may include isn't an exhaustive list. One of the key points to keep in mind is the agency has no authority to require information deemed by the state to be classified, nor does it have the authority to actually approve or disapprove the activity. So at what point should or could the material be withdrawn from safeguards, and when should safeguards be reapplied? Well, the material should spend as little time as possible outside safeguards. As agreed by the drafters of 153, such peaceful nuclear activities as transport and storage, and activities or processes that merely change the chemical or isotopic composition of nuclear material, such as enrichment or reprocessing, are not intrinsically military and therefore not entitled to exclusion from safeguards under paragraph 14. Insofar as Australia will be receiving the submarines already equipped with the reactors, there will inevitably be some transport and storage of the submarines, so that will have to be addressed. But as Australia will not be engaged in enrichment or reprocessing of the reactor fuel, that could simplify the negotiation process. However, clarity would have to be had regarding when the material in the reactor would have to be brought back under safeguards. What are the implications for additional protocols? The existence of an additional protocol could indeed mitigate the possible negative impacts on safeguards of a paragraph 14 arrangement. An AP, after all, offers the agency expanded access to information and locations, which increases the agency's ability to detect indications of undeclared nuclear material and activities. Many AP measures could be relevant to a nuclear naval propulsion program, depending on what activities are actually carried out by the non-nuclear weapon state. Would some of these provisions be suspended as well? If so, how would the suspension of AP measures impact the agency's ability to determine whether there are indications of undeclared nuclear material and activities in the state? More complicated still is how such suspension might impact the IAEA's drawing of safeguards conclusions, in particular, the drawing of a broader conclusion. Currently, as you probably know, if a CSA state has an additional protocol in force, and the agency sees no indications of diversion of declared material and no indications of undeclared nuclear material or activities in the state, it draws a broader conclusion, which states that all nuclear material remained in peaceful activities. Would the agency still be able to draw such a conclusion, or would there have to be a reformulation of the broader conclusion? While it is tempting to suggest that no paragraph 14 arrangement should be approved unless the state has an AP in force, I myself, not surprisingly, would be so tempted. Given the insistence by many states on the voluntary nature of additional protocols, such a position could expect to be met with some resistance. So, could a military-to-military transfer be invoked to get around the need for a paragraph 14 arrangement? My answer is a clear no. Any efforts to circumvent what I described doing an end run around safeguards should be resoundingly rejected, not just from a policy perspective, but from a legal perspective. This approach actually was raised in the context of the Canadian project and rejected by the Secretariat. But allow me to go into this a little bit more deeply, because I believe this is a most critical issue. Paragraph 1 of 153 tracks the language from the NPT, requiring the application of safeguards on all source, or special fissionable material in all peaceful nuclear activities. This reference to peaceful nuclear activities was intended to accommodate the interest among some non-nuclear weapon states in the late 1960s in nuclear-powered submarines, not as a means for securing an exclusion for nuclear material from safeguards due to its use in a military activity. In addition, paragraph 34C requires that nuclear material of a composition and purity suitable for fuel fabrication or isotopic enrichment, or produced later in the nuclear fuel cycle, as would be the case for nuclear material in reactor core, becomes subject to all of the safeguards procedures upon its import into a CSA state. Unlike other provisions in paragraph 34, 34C is not limited to the import of such material for peaceful purposes. Thus, the nuclear material contained in a reactor would become subject to safeguards upon its import, regardless of the purpose for which it is imported. Pursuant to paragraphs 92 to 96, a state must also provide advance notification to the agency of the expected transfer into the state of nuclear material in an amount greater than 1 effective kilogram, again, as would be the case for the nuclear material in a reactor core. In any case, it must be reported not later than the date on which the recipient state assumes responsibility for the material. Likewise, the state would be obliged to report the export of such material. In none of these provisions is there an exclusion for nuclear material used in or transferred for a military purpose. Now, allow me to address customary international law. The general rule under customary international law is that a treaty should be interpreted in good faith in accordance with the ordinary meaning to be given to the terms of an agreement in their context and in light of its object and purpose. From a plain reading of IMCIRC 153 in light of the provisions to which I've just referred, 153 must be interpreted as states having committed themselves to notifying the agency of the production and import of nuclear material, even if the material is intended for use in a non-prescribed military nuclear activity, and to resorting to the provisions of paragraph 14, should they wish to use nuclear material in such an activity. Under customary international law, recourse to supplementary means of interpretation is also possible, such as the preparatory work of a treaty, the negotiating history, for example, and the circumstances of its conclusion, particularly if this is necessary to confirm the meaning resulting from the application of the general rule I just spoke about, or to determine the meaning when interpretation in accordance with the general rule leaves the meaning ambiguous or obscure, or leads to a result which is manifestly absurd or unreasonable. In this instance, a review of the negotiating history of 153 clearly confirms the interpretation of the general rule that I articulated. 3 points. Committee 22 agreed the agency should be consulted and satisfactory administrative arrangements reached concerning the use of any nuclear material for military purpose permitted under the NPT, whether or not the material was initially under safeguards. It was further noted that the provision should thus be applied to all material which was either actually under safeguards and to be withdrawn, or which had never been placed under safeguards and was intended to be used in a permitted nuclear activity. In addition, there was a change made by the negotiators to the Secretariat's original proposed draft for paragraph 14, specifically to avoid any ambiguity that might suggest that nuclear material would not be subject to safeguards under the agreement if it were assigned at the moment of production to a non-explosive military activity. In light of the above, to interpret paragraph 1 of 153 as providing what would be tantamount to an automatic exclusion from safeguards of nuclear material because it is used in or produced for use in a military activity would, in my view, be manifestly absurd and unreasonable, creating an enormous loophole in safeguards, thereby defeating the very object and purpose of comprehensive safeguards agreements, contrary to international treaty law. Just as an aside, although it had nothing to do with submarines, I just wanted to point out that in the context of North Korea in 1993, the agency advised North Korea that there was no automatic exclusion for agency access to information or locations simply by virtue of such information or locations being associated with military activities. My final point. While some will argue that Australia's sterling non-proliferation credentials should allow for greater flexibility, it's clear that any arrangement agreed to will inevitably be invoked as a precedent by other states. To that end, whatever the arrangement, it must be designed as fit for purpose, regardless of who the partner states might be. And when you are asked whether the arrangement is acceptable, might I suggest you just change the names of the parties involved and see if you're still happy with it. With that, I turn the floor back to Elena.
Thank you, Laura, as always. Yeah, you know, the amount of knowledge you have, that's uncomparable, but I really like your last couple of sentences. This is like one message if could stick to listeners in our today's webinar. But let's go to somebody who actually dealt with Australia's safeguards for a number of years. John, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you to Laura. That was very comprehensive. Let me start by referring to two papers that I have on the Vienna Centre website on this issue, and what we don't have time to cover in the discussion and the Q&A today could be largely answered in those two papers if people want to look them up. Paragraph 14 has been described frequently as a loophole in safeguards. Clearly, it's a matter that must be approached very cautiously, carefully, but I do think that the proliferation risks have been overstated. My argument is that the greatest risks in this area are where a state has fuel cycle activities that have been established in support of a naval program, particularly uranium enrichment. In a non-nuclear weapons state, these fuel cycle activities will be under safeguards, but with enrichment, particularly a sizable enrichment activity, rapid breakout is possible. And the problem here is whether safeguards can be relied upon to provide timely warning. Scenarios for diversion of fuel from submarines, in most cases, I think are improbable. I go through some of those very briefly in my main paper. There are obvious practical issues of how would the diversion be hidden, how does the submarine operate if it has no fuel, and so on. But it is necessary to have appropriate monitoring or verification arrangements to prevent the diversion from submarines becoming attractive simply because they're not covered. But in considering what kind of verification activities are appropriate, we need to look at what is realistic and also what is sufficient. In looking at the suspension of safeguards under Para 14, the primary responsibility for both the state and for the agency is to be able to demonstrate that the prohibition in the NPT against diversion of nuclear material to nuclear weapons is being met. A minimalist interpretation of paragraph 14 is not likely to be sufficient. And we must recall that paragraph 14 was written 50 years ago, before the safeguard system had even been developed. What hadn't been thought through very well at that time can clearly be seen now to be not appropriate in today's circumstances. So it's incumbent on the agency and the state together to agree a reasonable approach which will meet the NPT obligations. If agreement proves to be not possible between the state and the agency, the board of governors cannot be expected to agree to an arrangement if it believes that the agency cannot meet its responsibilities. Just discussing very briefly the AUKUS proposal, Australia under this proposal would acquire probably 8 nuclear-powered submarines from either the United States or the United Kingdom. These will be HEU fueled with a lifetime core. There's been a lot of discussion about the problems of having large quantities of HEU in non-weapon states. I think the point is that the reactors will be built into the submarine hulls and will be totally inaccessible to either to Australia or to anybody else without major structural work on the submarines. The submarines with their fuel will be returned to the supplier, the US or the UK, at the end of the 30-year service life. Let me quickly add here too that at this stage, this is just a proposal. It's subject to an 18-month feasibility study. So it's not at this stage certain that the proposal will proceed. And if it does proceed, we don't expect to see the first submarine launched until somewhere around 2036. So we're quite a long way away from seeing this in actuality. The situation with what's proposed here is totally different to a situation where a state is going to be producing fuel and regularly refueling the submarine. In those circumstances, there are diversion opportunities which clearly have to be closed off and present verification challenges, might be too strong a word, but certainly complications. In the case of the Australian proposal, as I said, Australia will not be able to access the fuel without disabling the submarine. If the submarine hull is cut open, the submarine will clearly be out of action for months, if not years. I did see somewhere that in the US, where this kind of work has been undertaken, there's something like a 2-year period to rebuild the submarine. And the obvious problem too is that if Australia diverted the fuel, we don't produce our own fuel. How do we refuel the submarine so it's obvious that it's not obvious that it's not operating? This situation should be relatively easy for the IAEA to monitor through measures such as visiting submarines during port visits, overhead surveillance of shipyards that are capable of doing rebuilding work, and under the additional protocol, monitoring things like the availability of shielded containers suitable for moving irradiated fuel and hot cells suitable for treatment of irradiated fuel. So the monitoring arrangements should be relatively easy. Australia, I'm assured by my colleagues, Australia is determined to set a very strong precedent here for having strong arrangements in place, as we understand full well that if others proceed with nuclear-powered submarines in the future, this will be quite an important precedent for how other cases will be approached. And let me conclude by touching on some broader issues coming out of this proposal. One is, as Laura touched on, the need for the additional protocol in states that are considering paragraph 14 arrangements because of the need for the agency to be able to do more than traditional safeguards in relation to things like hot cells. and enrichment manufacture and so on. Another issue is that of prospective HEU production by non-weapon states. This is not safeguards as such, but as a non-proliferation measure, I think the international community has to consider very seriously whether there should be an international agreement reached against production of HEU in non-weapon states. And for that matter, it would certainly be the right direction to take for the weapon states to also agree no more HEU. There are still well over 1,000 tonnes of HEU in the current weapon states, and there's absolutely no reason to produce more of it. I mentioned before that the real problem in this area is other fuel cycle activities that would be in support of the naval program, and I think this flags again an issue that was looked at in the past and kind of brushed aside, which is, do we need multi-nation arrangements for control of sensitive nuclear technologies like enrichment and reprocessing? And finally, I just mentioned there are also implications for disarmament, because when the weapon states get serious about disarmament, the naval loophole is going to be much more significant in relation to their programs, simply because of the extensive size and the long history. So serious thought needs to be considered to how it would carry out verification in those programs. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Thank you also kind of taking some of the issues that the ACOS deal kind of raises, including the issue of the additional protocol for states that pursuing naval propulsion policies related to HEU use, overall enrichment and processing arrangement, and for the disarmament, future disarmament. But we have some of the upcoming events, including the 10th NPT review conference in January. And many of the experts are already raising the question, what kind of impact the deal itself and its announcement could have on the deliberation in the NPT review conference and in other fora. So that's one of the questions that I may ask you to contemplate. And there are a couple of additional questions that I would pose, and I don't know what's the best way, who will go first, or which way to, which one is better for one or the other, but I would suggest maybe I will go to John, and then you can raise your hand if you want to chime in, Laura, or we'll go back and forth. Would you like to, John,
Sure.
to start with the NPT?
Yeah. Thank you, Elena. I don't have very much to say on that, because I must admit I haven't been following NPT review conferences closely in recent years, but in principle, I don't see that this should be a major issue for the conference. The NPT itself is certainly written to allow for naval propulsion programs. It's an authorized activity under the NPT, and I don't see why that should be controversial. The only issue that would be of concern is this in fact a loophole which could increase proliferation risk? And I think from our discussion today, it can be seen that there's fairly strong sentiment that whatever the loophole is will be managed so that it's not a loophole. And I think we can present a positive story to the review conference on that.
Thank you, John. Laura?
Just real quickly, I agree with John. I think there are issues that are going to take precedence over the submarine issue. I would expect that somewhere in the final declaration, should there be one, that there will be a reference to the use of HEU in non-nuclear weapon states. That's been a focus, indeed, in the US as well over the past few years. But I think there are other issues that will rise to the fore, not so much the submarine program. And John pointed out, I mean, it is something that was contemplated under the NPT. Okay, that was a few years ago, but I don't think it's going to be a deal breaker.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna pose a couple of additional questions. First, John Tilleman, you know who he is, your colleague.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, he's asking about the timing of the kind of all these deal and where some of these discussions and safeguards arrangements should be coming in. So should they start like in what time frame, assuming the details have been negotiated already of what is supplied and when? So when does the discussion about the safeguards start? Like as soon as the deal is struck, before, when the 10 years before the vessel might come into play, or 20 years before the delivery, or where do we start that conversation, basically? Or perhaps we shouldn't rush and do it at the later stage, but in terms of figuring out how it's going to be applied and where to start it, what is your suggestion? And related to that is a second question that his question and some other questions posed overlap is, what about the suppliers? What does it mean for them in terms of what kind of regulatory hurdles they need to cross? What other arrangements they need to have in place before they provide fuel, whatever, in different formats that we discussed during the webinar. Who would like to start first, Laura or you, John?
I'll let John.
Okay.
Okay. Well, in terms of when should we start to flesh out some of these details, discussions have already been initiated between Australia and the other partners and the agency. I don't know what's intended, but it would certainly be my view that within this 18-month study, there should already be fairly substantive discussions on what a safeguards approach might look like, apart from anything else, because that's a major part of the feasibility. But Australia and the agency have to have a clear idea of what each wants, but also the supplier, either the US or the UK, will also need to think through how verification might touch on their activity in fuel fabrication. Does it need to? But if it does need to, how do they protect sensitive information? So I think there's a certain amount of work that should be done fairly soon to set broad parameters, and for the sake of transparency, for that matter, because I don't think it'll do anybody any good if there's a sense that this is all being done behind closed doors. But in terms of getting into the very detailed, very fine detail of how verification and monitoring might work, that would probably be further down the track, because after all, this is a very, we're at least 15 years away from the first submarine. So there's no particular reason to conclude a detailed arrangement now, which might turn out to need modifying for practical reasons. So that's how I would see it. On the question, what does this mean for suppliers? I think the main point is the one I just touched on. Are there sensitive information aspects which suppliers would want to be sure to protect, and how do they then arrange that with the agency in such a way that both sides' needs are met, that the agency can follow the material flow to the extent it needs to, while protecting military secrets. Thank you.
Okay, Laura, would you like to add something?
Only that if you take a look at my Federation of American Scientists article, I included some assessment about the implications for safeguards in the nuclear weapon states as possible suppliers. But John's absolutely on point. I think this issue of how they're going to handle information considered to be classified in the supplier countries is going to be critical.
Okay, thank you both. As several people actually wonder, including Trevor Finlay and some others, about the broader conclusion for a country with, say, with HEU and its outside of the safeguards. And also whether it would lead, it's also Matt Butworth asked whether nuclear naval propulsion program is accompanied by, would be accompanied by withdrawal or broader conclusion. And whether it would mean higher levels of scrutiny in a state for its safeguards compliance. Laura,
I think
you're ready to go first.
I think those are some of the $50 million questions that have to be asked and answered. I've seen the formulation of the IAEA safeguards conclusions evolve over years in response to shifting circumstances. And I think what's going to be important is that the agency step back from the AUKUS deal and think about the implications for all countries, and not just one of our favorite things in the IAEA used to be drop a footnote. I really think they need to take a deeper look at what does this mean for the conclusions that are drawn, particularly whether, if additional protocol measures are suspended, does that somehow constrain the agency's ability to confirm with a high degree of credibility that there are no undeclared nuclear activities in the state. It is less problematic if the state doesn't suspend those provisions and isn't carrying out enrichment or processing domestically, but one has to assume that there will be circumstances that would develop otherwise. And really now's the time to give a lot of thought to that. I think those questions are incredibly important, whether for granting what we now call a broader conclusion, or reconsidering whether a state that has had a broader conclusion, such as Australia, would then have a simple conclusion drawn about no diversion of declared nuclear material. $50 million questions. John?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the language of the broader conclusion will have to be refined, because at the moment it does only refers to material in peaceful use. So it'll have to be written in a way that accommodates non-prescribed military activities. But if there's a satisfactory monitoring system for the material that's actually on board naval vessels, I don't see why the broader conclusion can't accommodate that, and the agency can still draw a similar conclusion that there's been no diversion of nuclear material in the state.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to other questions. George Moore asks, can you address the situation where either the UK or US provides or leases a nuclear-powered submarine to Australia in the near term to allow Australia to build competence in operating such submarines?
Go ahead, John, you first. I have some thoughts on that.
I was going to say, there has been some speculation that might happen, which brings forward the timetable for this becoming a practical issue if it does happen. But I think the issues are the same, basically, in our case, in the AUKUS case, because either way, Australia gets a submarine that's got the fuel built in, whether we own the sub or whether we lease it, that makes no difference. And the monitoring arrangements would be the same. It might be different for other states. Well, India, for instance, is, well, not that it's under comprehensive safeguards, of course, but it's an example of a state that has leased a submarine, a nuclear-powered submarine, ahead of building its own. So maybe others might go down that path, and that's something that would have to be addressed if it happens.
I couldn't agree with John more. It doesn't, I can't agree with John more than I already do. Because it doesn't matter whether it's leased or purchased, that submarine is going to be carried out under the jurisdiction, operated under the jurisdiction and control of Australia. And the same principles apply, as I described in my comments, about the requirement for safeguards to be applied to that kind of material, and for imports of such material to come under safeguards. So that is an example of one of those workarounds that I don't think should be pursued. Not that they shouldn't lease it, that I don't have a problem with that, but that it shouldn't operate to circumvent paragraph 14.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to hear that myself. Next question here, okay, Nakanishi. And the question here is a broader kind of transfer of technology. It's not only about the nuclear fuel, but it's also about the know-how, how to build submarines and fitting them. And that also, what are the legal and technical difficulties with that to both the supplier and recipient countries, from nuclear weapon states to non-nuclear weapon states? And say, after acquiring such technology, further transfer from non-nuclear weapon states, say, to another non-nuclear weapon states. So it's more of a kind of broader technical and military capability transfer. John?
I don't think I've got any comment. It's a propulsion system. It's not nuclear weapon technology. There's no, in principle, issue. The only issue would be the concern of the technology holder to protect their technology interest. But in terms of non-proliferation, it's not an issue.
Okay, Laura?
I agree. When they talk about protecting classified information, that was put into 153, not from a non-proliferation point of view, but because back then so many aspects of nuclear enabled propulsion were considered to be classified. Now, I already mentioned the case of Germany and Japan, who back in the early days, had commercial nuclear propulsion for surface vessels. So the implications for the sensitivity of submarines is how you design the core and how long the submarine can stay underwater. And those are military considerations rather than non-proliferation concerns, in my view.
And speed and so on as well.
Yeah.
All of those sorts of things.
Okay, thanks so much. There is another question coming from Wilmers. You may know that his impression that from your comments, John, is that Australia will basically have no access to HEU in the core. Hence, the diversion is pretty unlikely. The question is, what could be the safeguards implication of an arrangement whereby the material would not become Australia property, but would be leased by Australia from the supplier? Is such an option something that is being contemplated? So
Well,
we see where all the questions are geared towards, like, can we find a loophole?
Well, clearly the material will be in our jurisdiction, in Australia's jurisdiction, and therefore Australia will be responsible for observing its treaty obligations. Our NPT obligations will apply to that material regardless of its legal status, whether it's leased or whether it's bought. It doesn't matter. It's still our legal responsibility. The only issue that I can see with the material being inaccessible is that it's not verifiable in a conventional material accountancy way. I'm assuming that that the US or the UK would provide figures for the HEU content, but they might be an estimated figure rather than an actual figure. The actual figure could be a military secret, but a figure would be given which would go onto the Australian inventory. Because material accountancy verification won't be carried out on it, the precise quantity doesn't matter. What's essential is that the agency can see that we haven't cut up the submarine to access the material. And if we haven't done that and the submarine goes back to the supplier, then the traditional kind of verification, it simply isn't called for. So it's a novel situation.
It's kind of the ultimate in containment measures.
Yeah.
Okay, no loophole, should be subject to safeguards. Anyway, I know that in the media and among the experts there is quite a bit of a discussion, and particularly that appeared earlier when we were all guessing whether it will be HEU, LEU, whether the Australia will be producing some of the material or not. There have been many suggestions for potentially for Australia to set up some even precedent and example, including like renouncing enrichment and processing and some other things. But you also, John, mentioned in your presentation that actually this deal could actually set up a precedent and some strong arrangements in case similar arrangements or other naval propulsion programs, whether they involve transfer or not, that this could set some positive precedent. Have you given thought, you and both Laura, what would be these kind of strong arrangements and the positive side of the deal that could actually bring us forward. I've heard about the AP probably, but Australia already has it. But any other areas where it could actually help us with the safeguards in the future, and then non-proliferation?
I think as regards safeguards, what would be important is that the state, in this case Australia, would be as transparent as possible to the agency. Paragraph 14 can be given a very narrow interpretation. I mean, one interpretation of it is that it totally excludes safeguards as such. And that would be an appalling approach to take for all the obvious reasons. I think Australia would be anxious to go in very strongly in the other direction and say to the agency, whatever you think you need to do to provide assurance to the international community that there's been no diversion of this material, you can do. The intention of para 14 was only to protect sensitive military information. And that should be done in a way where both sides, both the agency and the state, can achieve their objectives. So in that general sense, Australia would be setting out to establish a good precedent. I'd argue that the precedent where the fuel is totally inaccessible to the state is a wonderful precedent. Others, of course, would be nervous about the fact that there are, I don't know, 10, 15 warheads traveling in one vessel, and what a temptation this might be to insert state name here. That would we necessarily like to see that in some other countries we can think of? So that's something that's got to be thought through. But the less opportunity a state has to actually get its hands on the material, the better. And the other aspect of it being HEU is that we need to, the weapon states need to run down their stocks somehow. And personally, I think naval propulsion isn't such a bad way of doing it, of destroying HEU. On the broader question of not producing further HEU, that goes beyond the safeguards realm, but I do think it's about time an FMCT was taken seriously, and the International Committee needs to think about what the scope of the FMC should be, and an outright prohibition on HEU production, for instance, would be a pretty good objective.
There's another aspect, and that's on the suppliers. Maybe the suppliers are the ones who should be saying, we'll sell you the submarine reactor core if you agree to forego enrichment and reprocessing. That's about as heavy a lift as the FMCT, but maybe not quite as heavy.
Okay. Well, we reached the end of our webinar today. I'm extremely, delighted that you both went so deep into some of these legal and technical issues that many of us struggling to understand. And then the questions also kind of speak to that. You went into many these details that are very difficult for people who are not spent many years working on these issues to comprehend. But also thank you for your remarks about the overall impact of the deal, about the potential actually incentive from it to jumpstart some of the other discussion. I very like John, your suggestion of FMCT issues and also promoting HEU. minimization and non-use in future application. But I want all of our listeners today and viewers to join me in giving you many thanks and wishing you all the best, and also thank our viewers and wish them all the best and be safe and healthy. Thank you so much, Laura and John. All the best to everyone.
Good.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.